Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to America House. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Christiane Hofland. I'm the director of America House, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this evening. Nina Jankowicz has been one of our favorite volunteers at America House over the past year. You may have seen her here at America House leading our open mic nights, helping with our pre-election party in the fall, helping with English language programs, leading yoga classes, among many other activities at America House. But you might not have been aware that she's also been here all year as a Fulbright-Clinton fellow, a strategic communications advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she's been conducting research on disinformation in the media in Ukraine. And so, while we're at it, if you haven't already seen Nina's piece in Washington Post, she just got published last week. The name of the article is Our Biggest Mistake in the Fight Against Fake News. So if you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. And for now, please join me in welcoming Nina Jankowicz.
Thank you so much, Christiane. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I want to thank you and the staff at America House for making this place such a great home away from home. I've really enjoyed being here and helping out at all the events over the past 7 months, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do so for the rest of my time in Ukraine. So thank you very much. Everybody give America House a big round of applause. So I'm really happy that you're all here tonight to talk about disinformation and fake news, which has become even more of an important topic in our daily lives since the election. I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of the research that I've been doing over the past couple of months, and I look forward to taking your questions and having a discussion with you afterward. So away we go. This is a quote from Peter Pomerantsev, who you may have read before. I'm not going to read it to you. Does anybody have an idea of when Mr. Pomerantsev said this? It was in a testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Just shout out a year. 2013, close. Anybody else? Okay, it's 2014. But what is interesting is that this is 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago at this point, and we're kind of still in the same spot, I would think. I don't think that we have really made that much progress in the fight against disinformation. And so when I got to Ukraine, I wanted to find out why that was. It seemed like there were a lot of different anti-disinformation projects going around, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe as a whole. And so I wanted to map the response, the Western response to disinformation, in 4 sectors: the multilateral, unilateral, NGO, and think tank sectors, and also encourage coordination between all of these groups. But as I did my research and talked to people around the continent, I realized that coordination wasn't the only problem that we had. We actually weren't addressing the problem at its root causes, and the funding structures that we're using aren't very nimble. They're not allowing us to respond as quickly or as thoroughly as we need to this extremely urgent problem. Oops, I'm not used to these clicker things. So just a little bit about me before we go on. This is a picture of me. I'm a Fulbright-Clinton public policy fellow, as Christiane said. You might not know what that means. You've probably heard of the Fulbright program. Fulbright-Clinton is a newer program targeted at mid-career professionals. There are about 21 of us around the world. Chris, right here, is the other one in Ukraine, working at the Ministry of Justice. And as Christiane said, I'm working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We provide advice and support to these ministries, in addition to promoting mutual understanding, which is what the Fulbright program does as a whole. And in addition to all of that, we also conduct research projects. Just so you know a little bit of my background, because it really informs how I looked at this research. I have a background in foreign assistance. So before I came to Ukraine, I worked for the National Democratic Institute on Russia and Belarus programs. And before that, worked for the Office of the Coordinator of Assistance to Europe and Eurasia at the State Department, which is the office basically that decides where all of US foreign assistance should go to this entire region. And as you can probably guess from those two jobs, I love this region. I've lived in Russia. My background is Polish and Ukrainian. I did 2 degrees in Europe and Eurasia. So this is the region that I'm really passionate about. Oh, and I also tweet. So you can follow me on Twitter at Wikipedia. So how did I do this research? I read a bunch of stuff. And then I did some interviews in 25 countries, or 6 countries, 25 interviews. That would be a lot of countries, wow. And have spent, as Christiane said, the past 7 months here in Ukraine. And here are the main ideas after all of that. There we go. 1, no matter what disinformation environment you are in, citizens are harboring an extreme distrust in both media and government. Secondly, Russia's disinformation activities are exploiting this trust gap between citizens and media and citizens and government, but our own response to disinformation doesn't address that at all. All of these solutions, as we'll see in a couple minutes, are very top level. And in order to really make a dent against disinformation, we need to address the trust gap. We need to make sure that we are supporting media in this really crowded media environment, and also helping people recognize what constitutes quality coverage, or else the other investments that we're making are going to fail to yield results. So we're going to talk a little bit about the trust gap first. This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a yearly survey done by a company in Britain. This came out in January 2017, and basically what they do is compare how the informed public, so folks like you, experts, people with a high education, people who are working in government, NGOs, business, and media, view trust towards those institutions, and how the mass population, people who aren't involved in any of those institutions, view them. And they saw what they called an implosion of trust in 2017. Now, not all the countries that we're going to be talking about today are here. They only survey 28 countries. But what I think is really interesting is down here at the bottom, the lowest trust, you may not be able to see, is Poland and Russia. So Poland, on one hand, a democratic country which has recently made a transition from a post-communist society, and Russia, which is an authoritarian regime, both have an extremely low trust in government. So that's kind of, and institutions in general. This is your overview, and now we're going to talk a little bit more on a country-by-country basis. So this data is a little bit old. This is from Gallup polling, showing Ukrainians' confidence in national government. And as you can see, there was a big drop-off. Only 8% of the population polled expressed confidence in their national government in 2015. And I would wager that that hasn't changed much in the past 2 years. In social institutions, you can kind of compare who's trusted and who's not here. You can see the armed forces of Ukraine and NGOs are the only ones with positive trust rankings on this survey. And both Ukrainian and Russian mass media have a pretty high level of distrust, as does the government and the parliament. This is looking at the EU countries that I had interviews in. So nobody, even in countries like Latvia or the EU as a whole, an aggregate of the 28 countries, no one really trusts their national government. And the distrust ratings are actually pretty high. And this is my own country, the United States. We also trust our military, which I think is interesting, as well as scientists. Teachers to some degree, and then the trust ratings go down when you get to the media, business leaders, and elected officials. But what I think is really interesting is that these distrust ratings go across political parties. Doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, people equally distrust public institutions in the United States. And we'll get to a little bit about why that trust gap has come up later. But for now, I'd like to talk about defining the disinformation threat. So there are a lot of terms that people use when talking about the disinformation crisis. I've chosen to use the term disinformation as opposed to propaganda, information warfare, fake news, etc., because I think this is a wider problem than just fake stories or misleading stories being planted in the media by Russia or other actors, because it's not just Russia, although it is mostly them. So this disinformation crisis utilizes the typical tools of propaganda, which I've just talked a little bit about. They also include things like trolls or propaganda networks like RT and Sputnik, which are funded by the government. But it also uses more unique techniques. And it's hardly ever as explicitly pro-Russian as Soviet propaganda. This disinformation's aim is not necessarily to promote a pro-Russian viewpoint, but just to inspire distrust and confusion on a general scale. And most of all, it exploits the trust gap that we were talking about before. So this here is a picture of the 2010 Smolensk plane crash, which killed Polish President Lech Kaczynski and 90 members of the Polish political elite. And the reason that I've put it up here is because when I was in Poland, people can't agree on much in Poland these days. The political situation is not great, very tense, but people from both sides of the political aisle told me that the fact that Russia has withheld the wreckage of this plane crash is the biggest piece of disinformation in Poland right now. And let me explain what that means a little bit. Poland doesn't have very good relations with Russia. In fact, many people would say that Poland is inoculated toward Russian propaganda. But by withholding this wreckage and knowing that the party that's in power right now, Law and Justice, is prone to conspiracy theories and in fact started propagating these theories soon after the crash, Russia is inspiring distrust between political parties. It is also ruining the image of the governing party in Poland around Greater Europe, because 3 different investigations have concluded that the wreckage was a result, or the crash was a result of pilot error and bad weather. So essentially, by not lifting a finger, Russia is propagating these conspiracy theories. And this is just an example of how disinformation is not always just a fake news story. So again, the aim is not to convince or persuade about Russia's greatness in the world. It's just to undermine. Rather than agitating audiences into action, Russia is seeking to keep them hooked and distracted, passive, and paranoid. And with all of that in mind, there we go. This is my definition of disinformation. Any activity perpetrated by a hostile party that exploits fissures in society to sow doubt, distrust, discontent, and further divide populations and their governments. And we face a bunch of challenges that Russia does not. I think this is why we've kind of been on the back foot in our response to propaganda and disinformation. And the biggest one is that Russia is one country. I'll keep pressing it. There we go. Russia is one country, one government, led by the will of one man, and they can direct all of their resources to wherever he says at any moment. Where, on the flip side, we are 30 different governments with 30 different foreign policy priorities. Even within the EU, as we'll talk about in a bit, they can't really agree on the best response to disinformation or whether it's a problem or not at all. And this makes our response kind of piecemeal. Secondly, Russia, as you all know, has a government-controlled press. In fact, Putin at any time can instruct the editors of major newspapers to take a certain editorial line. In fact, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, he gave out something like 600 medals of honor or the equivalent to journalists that covered the annexation in a way he thought agreeable to the Kremlin line. Whereas in the West, we would never deign to do that. We greatly respect freedom of the press, and any project that we funded or any media organization that we supported, even organizations like RFERL or Voice of America, which are funded by the government, still have a large degree of editorial freedom. And lastly, Russia likes to operate in a shroud of secrecy, whereas any project that the US government or any other Western government would fund, you better bet would have a big stamp that says funded by the US government on it. And what does that do? When a distrusting population sees this information, no matter how nicely packaged or convincing it is, or how filled with facts, if they see that seal that says funded by Great Britain or Canada, they're less likely to trust it if they already distrust the governments in the West. So something to keep in mind. We also face some challenges because this is now a growing industry. As you can see in this graph, in 2017, a study by the Duke Reporters Lab that's been going on for a couple years showed that there are now 114 active fact checkers in the world, up from 44 in 2014. So as the information space and the anti-disinformation response becomes a bit more crowded, there's competition between organizations that ought to be working together, competition for funding, competition for attention in a crowded information market. And when funding is available, it's often short-term. In grants that I used to work with, the longest grant that we would see would be about 3 years long, which in the lifespan of a media organization is fairly short, and means that organizations working in the new media space are often writing grant applications all the time rather than focusing on their work. And worrying about where their next grant is going to come from, if they're going to be able to pay their rent, if they're going to be able to pay their people. And they can't focus on the reporting that is so important in repairing the trust gap. There's also a general lack of coordination between governments and between multilateral bodies. I've seen that in my research. I've seen it in the interviews I've done. And while there's a lot of goodwill to try to coordinate as much as possible, it's extremely hard to do when, again, everyone has these competing foreign policy priorities. And lastly, as I said before, there's a focus on surface-level solutions, process, and awareness raising, which isn't getting at the fundamental thing that makes disinformation so successful in the first place. So now we're going to talk a little bit about case studies. Some interviews that I've done, and some of these may be familiar to you, some of them may not be. I'll just give a brief overview of what their objectives are, their reach, and I will say one thing about reach, kind of a caveat. I'm using just the numbers on 2 major social media networks to measure this. One day, I would love to measure engagement instead, but it takes a little bit longer, and I'm on a short time frame with limited budget. So this is what I've got for you today. So first we're going to talk about fact-checking organizations. A lot of you may be familiar with StopFake. I was lucky enough to be on StopFake twice. I loved the experience. I think they do really great work. They were one of the first organizations to come out in the response to Russian disinformation in Ukraine 3 years ago. Their audience is mostly Ukraine watchers for their English language broadcasts, and they have a growing resonance in Russia for their Russian language broadcasts. And as you know, their objective is to verify or refute disinformation and propaganda about specifically events in Ukraine, as well as some elsewhere in the region through articles and videos. They have a pretty large reach on Facebook and Twitter. And what I think is most compelling about StopFake is they now have this database of over 1,000 fakes that they've debunked, which is really integral for our further study of disinformation. It shows the patterns in techniques that Russia uses, as well as how they implement their disinformation, at least in the information space specifically, without talking about those unique techniques we talked about before. According to the folks I spoke to there, about half of all of their readers are from Russia now, although many are using VPNs and other means to get to the website, which has been blocked in some parts of the country. And they're also starting to conduct trainings for journalists, which is really important. Because I was told time and time again by experts and journalists around Europe that even at the best media organizations, human resources and monetary resources are becoming such a problem in journalism as a whole that often fact-checking doesn't happen and standards are slipping a bit. So the fact that StopFake, with all of its multitude of experience, is going out there and training people and using Ukraine's experience, I think is really something commendable. This is a think tank based in the Czech Republic in Prague. They put out a weekly newsletter called Kremlin Watch, which also does debunking, mostly focused on the Czech Republic and Central Europe. And its audience is Western policymakers. It's in English. They're focusing on things that affect European politics and doing kind of a lot of advocacy and lobbying with their debunking in order to raise awareness about disinformation within Europe. They have a pretty decent reach on Twitter and Facebook, and because of their lobbying, they were able to establish a hybrid threat center which addresses disinformation in Prague within the Ministry of Interior. And they've also had success using their research to get advertisers to stop advertising on websites that support the Kremlin line in Prague, which I think is really admirable. We'll talk a little bit later about fact-checking in general and whether or not it has resonance outside of the policymaking community. Something to keep in mind as we move on. This is the EU's debunking service, the East Stratcom Task Force. They also try to promote European narratives around Europe, but the biggest thing they do, and by far the most popular and effective thing, is also a newsletter in which they debunk things. They use volunteers to do this, often pulling from venues like Stop Fake. And there's a little bit of duplication going on there, but they've really raised the profile of disinformation within the European Parliament. However, they're still fighting for funding and staff and can't really do the work that they need to do without getting funding. But unfortunately, the politics in the European Union right now, as I mentioned before, some people don't believe still that disinformation is a threat. So they have this disinfo review that they do every week. Mostly targeting European policymakers. Moving on. This is one of the newer projects, fact-checking projects called polygraph.info. They have kind of an interesting model. Their idea is to debunk or prove true or false statements made by public officials in the former Soviet Union and former communist space. But their audience is very interesting. They're only targeting English speakers in the former Soviet Union, which seems kind of backwards, if you ask me, because there's a whole lot of people who don't speak English in the former Soviet Union who are probably the targets of disinformation more than educated people who do speak English. They just started in January, so they're very small still. Their reach on Twitter is not very large, and their successes are too early to say. But this is an example of a project that I don't believe is necessarily reaching the audience that it ought to be reaching. It needs to be thinking about who the target is, who is most affected by disinformation. So with all of these fact-checking organizations, it's, like I said, it's great that fact-checking exists because it allows us to identify the patterns in disinformation and look to see what Russia might do next, maybe predict. And it's drawn a lot of attention to the problem. I mean, Stop Fake was in the New York Times. Christiane was on CNN when Christiane Amanpour talked about Stop Fake. And this is great. The more attention that we can draw to the disinformation problem, the better. However, fact-checking is inherently reactive, and it allows Russia to set the narrative. It also draws attention to some news sites and claims that don't necessarily deserve all of that attention. And again, it doesn't address the trust gap. So does anybody have a crazy uncle that when you go to Thanksgiving or another family holiday, we like to talk about this in America, where your whole family is together for Thanksgiving and you've got one person, right? One person who just has conspiracy theories, there we go, out the wazoo, and you can't convince them of anything. Does anybody have anybody like that in their family? Raise your hand. Yeah, we all do. And with those people, it doesn't matter how many facts you bring them, right? Because they're just convinced. They're convinced that they're entitled to their own opinion, and nothing is going to change their mind. So with these people who are most affected by disinformation, who are most likely to believe conspiracy theories, will fact-checking really do any good? This is a quote from a guy, a journalist, the editor of the second largest Czech daily, Dnes, in Prague, who himself does not believe that disinformation is a problem for the Czech Republic. He says, people think that fighting lies means fighting opinion. He believes that people, especially in post-communist societies where freedom of information is a fairly new concept and freedom of speech, should be able to consume and propagate whatever information they want. So this is something to think about when we are pursuing more and more fact-checking efforts. Now we're going to talk a bit about some think tank type projects. This is the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence located in Riga. And I thought for a very long time, this is an issue of branding, that all these guys did was debunk fakes. It turns out they're actually a think tank. Yeah. And this is because they don't really communicate this very well online. They write a lot of papers. Their goal is to enhance NATO's STRATCOM capabilities through their own analytical work. and they're assigned tasks from members of the NATO alliance, and they can kind of choose what's a priority for them. They also work on issues related to ISIS. They conduct comms training, both in person and online, mostly for officials, and publish a variety of reports. They have some challenges. They're also struggling with funding because not all NATO members, again, are prioritizing disinformation and sending people, seconding them to work at the Center of Excellence. And in terms of the reach of their reports, it doesn't really go beyond, again, the expert community. And this is the Czech Hybrid Threat Center that I talked a bit about before. What's really interesting is that the Hybrid Threat Center was established in January with the blessing of Czech President Zeman, who has been a little bit, I would say, cozy with Putin. Their mission is to advise the government on threats in the Czech information space and publicly debunk fakes pertaining to domestic issues in the Czech Republic. Again, what you'll mostly hear about when you read news coverage about this new center opening, and it's the first of its kind in Europe, no one else has this yet, is that they set up a Twitter account to debunk fakes. So again, an issue of branding. They actually do much more than that. They're more like a think tank. But now they're facing a public backlash in the Czech Republic because President Zeman called them out and said, we don't need a ministry of truth here in the Czech Republic, which is kind of funny considering that he was involved in their creation. So now they're on the back foot trying to justify their existence while also trying to coordinate the defense of the Czech election and kind of change the narrative into something positive so that people don't keep saying that fighting lies is fighting truth in the Czech Republic. And since they were just founded in January, it's kind of unclear what influence they have on Czech policy at this point, but it's just an interesting case study for any governments looking to form a similar domestic response to disinformation. So taking into account both the fact-checking services as well as these two think tank type organizations, they do great work in awareness building, right? But when are these efforts going to reach beyond our own echo policy chambers? What is our society going to look like at the point where we feel like, okay, we've raised enough awareness and now we can actually get to addressing what normal people think of fake news? But there is hope. There are some really great programs that we funded as a community, a Western donor community, that do address root causes. These are two discrete, small, short examples that I think if we used as a model to create more programming like this might be able to really have an effect. So the first one happens to be run by IREX, which is the implementer of America House, so way to go, IREX. The goal of this program, it's a media literacy program, was to enhance citizen capacity to establish reliability of news sources and content, as well as increase public demand for truthful reporting. And they did this by training 400 trainers, who then went out and trained 15,000 people across Ukraine in media literacy techniques, including how to know or to learn early on that you're being emotionally manipulated by one of those crazy titles you see on Facebook of news stories. Oops. Oh no, what have I done? Can you put it back? Thank you. And they also showed how to spot doctored photos and things like that. And they created a whole curriculum for these trainings with the help of StopFake and the Academy of Ukrainian Press. And after the training, the number of people who cross-checked sources increased by 29% over 3 months, which is a huge number. They also did an awareness-raising program in Ukraine, an ad campaign, which reached, you can see the numbers here, 20 million TV viewers, 8 million radio listeners, 10,000 YouTube users, and countless metro riders. Does anyone, well, let's play the ad first, and then I'll ask if anyone saw it.
Інформація як продукт. Вона теж може бути неякісною, неповною та навіть шкідливою. А що споживаєте ви? Якісну чи лише схожу на якісну? Будьте обережні. Перевіряйте інформацію. Споживайте свідомо.
So for those of you who don't speak Ukrainian, although I think that's very few of you in the audience, but maybe people at home, basically the ad says, information is a product, consume wisely. And after this ad campaign, IREX did polling, both before and after, and saw, I think, a 23% increase in the number of people who checked or who were aware of disinformation and the need to cross-check sources just after an ad campaign. This program ran for 9 months and had a very small funding level. I think it was about 600,000 Canadian dollars. Imagine what that could do if we funded it to a level that was a little bit, allowed it to reach all of the oblasts in Ukraine, for instance, or we funded it for more years than just 9 months. I think it could have a huge effect. Also, if media literacy curriculum was, new media literacy in particular, that focused on digital media literacy, was installed in schools, in workplaces, as part of training for government officials, this could have a huge effect. So we need to think about these things that aren't necessarily low-hanging fruit. The increase in population that understands media literacy, it's not going to be a quick curve, but it's a really important skill that we're not teaching right now, both in the United States and across Europe. And certainly this program didn't reach all 45 million Ukrainians, but it could have, I think, over time, a pretty large impact. I don't know why it's not working anymore, Sasha. I'm pressing it. Oops. Okay. Thanks. So, okay. Now it seems, is it me? There we go. All right. So this is another program that I really like. It is run by Free Press Unlimited, which is out of Amsterdam. And they have a Russian language news exchange. Basically what this is a group of 50 news organizations that are local and independent across the 7 Eastern Partnership countries. And they've kind of established a system wherein you can apply for a grant to do some investigative reporting with the understanding that by writing the story, by taking this grant, when you publish it, it can then be repackaged and distributed across all the other platforms, anybody who wants it, who's a member of the News Exchange. And what's really great about this is that the stories are resonant to local populations in these Eastern Partnership countries, which I think is the key of what we're missing in media right now. When I was a kid, my parents used to get the local New Jersey newspaper, the Star Ledger. It was delivered to our house every day. And as I grew older, the Star Ledger got thinner and thinner, and the coverage in it became less and less specific to the particular town or state that we lived in. And so my parents eventually stopped subscribing to it. But when you think about someone who, for instance, might be a farmer in Iowa, and they don't have that quality local news to go to, and they look at something like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and they don't see anything that applies to their daily lives, that's when the trust gap starts widening between people and media. And I see the same thing in the Ukrainian information environment in my work with the ministry, working with Ukrainian journalists. Local Ukrainian outlets here are super interested in Ukrainian international affairs and how Ukraine is interacting with Europe. That's great. But people are also interested in why, for instance, their playground in the Dvor is getting torn down, or what's going on in a school in Kyiv here. And it's really important to report on those local issues. And this Russian language news exchange facilitates that. It also trains its members in business skills, knowing that one day this program might not be there anymore. And they want them to be able to be self-sustaining, which is really important in today's journalism environment. And in a year, with just $1 million, it facilitated about 500 stories to be researched and exchanged, which were each viewed a minimum of 1 million times across platforms. Which again, this is peanuts in terms of foreign assistance, and it had a pretty large effect. So, how should we do this? How do we go about this? Should we just keep funding a bunch of projects like these, like IREX and Free Press Unlimited? Not exactly. It needs to be a whole cloth strategy. We can't just redirect money. There's another thing. There we go. We need to think about this as a whole. I'm not saying that we should just stop funding fact-checking sites. I'm not saying that we can only do stuff like this. Here's what I am saying. First, we need to continue strategically funding analytical fact-checking and consciousness-raising work. I heard a lot over the interviews that I did that folks were losing funding because priorities in terms of countries were shifting and they didn't have money to do their work anymore, or suddenly their funding was pulled and given to a new organization doing almost exactly the same thing. Instead, I would like to see longer-term grants. I would like to see training for organizations that do a really great job to train other newer organizations and show them the ropes. Things like that are really important. We need to be strategic about this and not leave people to sink or swim when the threat is still there. Secondly, again, long-term investments, especially in skills-building programs and campaigns that deal with media literacy, that deal with investigative journalism, as well as media partnerships like the News Exchange and study tours, I think, are also a great way for, especially within the Eastern European region, but maybe also for American journalists to come here and learn from the experience of Ukraine and other countries that have dealt with this problem before we have. Here we go. It helps when I do this little motion, I think. Across the board, I'd like us to see investing in longer programs with more flexible deliverables. So when the Ukraine crisis happened, we were a little bit caught off guard, and we do have these rapid response funding mechanisms. But when something changes rapidly, for instance, after the United States election, where it seemed very clear that Russia was going to go into Europe now and meddle in other elections, I'd like us to see I'd like to see us have longer, more flexible pots of money that we can then send around to deal with the crises as they happen. Right now, things are pretty rigid. In fact, one of the issues that I think is big for the coming years in Europe is that a lot of the countries that are dealing with fake news and disinformation right now are no longer on the list of assistance beneficiaries. They've graduated from foreign assistance. So countries like the Czech Republic and Poland, which are having a pretty big disinformation problem, are not able necessarily to receive the type of funding that Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia are able to receive because they're graduates of foreign assistance. So given the unique nature of the disinformation threat, I'd like to see us expand that list a little bit. I talked about the Rapid Response Fund already. And finally, we need to prioritize coordination between governments and multilateral structures. This is actually part of the recent Portman-Murphy counter-disinformation bill that was passed last year and President Obama signed. I'm not sure where that priority ranks for the current administration, but I would love to see my own government leading in the effort to coordinate between governments and multilateral structures. So, how do you fight disinformation in your daily life? I have two simple suggestions, and I'm very interested to hear yours when we discuss in just a little bit. The first one is to invest in journalism and actually pay for it, right? I love this cartoon of cavemen reading hieroglyphics and hitting a paywall. But really, we should all invest what it costs for a couple cups of coffee every month to pay for journalism, to support journalists, because the market that they're operating in right now is extremely tough, and the best thing that we can do as individual citizens is to support them this way. And then, of course, think before you share on Facebook. Read an article all the way through, and don't just share based on a headline. You all know how fake news spreads. And Facebook is one of the main ways. Facebook is now trying to get its own fact-checking platform in place so that it's automated within the social media platform itself. But you have a big part in that. And we can talk a little bit more as we discuss how you can engage people who are sharing fake news. I'm interested to hear your strategies because I myself have not figured it out. And finally, before I close today, this, as Christiane mentioned, is from the piece that I published in the Washington Post. I think it's important to know what winning the information war would look like. In my opinion, this is going to be people who are consuming news responsibly. and using it to inform a healthy criticism of the government. I'm not saying that we should ever trust media or the government entirely, right? That's not how democracy works. But we want people to read the news responsibly and then say, hey, I don't like what my government is doing. I don't like what's going on in the school down the street. And I read it in the newspaper, and now I'm going to start a petition about it or go to a protest. These are the types of things that aren't really going on in a healthy way in democracies across Europe right now. And this is where we need to go to. But if we're going to do that, we need programming that teaches people how and makes journalism sustainable enough that it can address the problems that people actually have. And that's all I've got for you tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and I'd love to take your questions. Sit down. I think there's a mic, which Sasha has. Anybody have questions?
Thank you for your speaking.
Thank you.
Does this sources of the fake news, does they observe the Ukrainian news? Because are they mostly focused on Russian news?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Does they somehow observe Ukrainian news? Because you must mostly say that they observe like Russian news. Is there take place fake news in Ukraine?
I think there's fake news everywhere. There was certainly a lot of fake news in the United States during the election. And yeah, we've seen Ukrainian sources of fake news propagated as well. I think all of these probably have a root in Russia, whether Russia, for instance, in the case of the election, used documents that it then released on WikiLeaks that news organizations then propagated. That's not necessarily fake news, like I was talking about at the beginning. It's still a form of disinformation, though. And yeah, I think there's fake news in Ukraine. There's fake news in Poland. In every country that I talked to, that I spoke with people in, there's fake news everywhere. Unfortunately, not all of it is necessarily propagated by Russia, but a majority of it, I think, especially in this region, is. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Vasil Babic. I work for international NGO Democracy Reporting International.
Cool.
And Ms. Jankowicz, my question actually is about governmental agencies. There was harsh critique in, Ukrainian political discourse, Facebook, within NGO activists about the Ministry of Truth or Ministry of Information in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on their activities and probably the same governmental activities in other countries in Europe?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I understand the desire behind to found parts of the government that deal with the disinformation crisis, but we have to be very careful, in my opinion. For instance, the Ministry of Information Policy, or even the Czech Hybrid Threat Center, or this new center that my own government is going to establish to fight disinformation. You need to be really careful to not trample on people's right to freedom of speech and freedom of information. The German government actually is now, I think, increasing its libel and slander laws in response to fake news that's happening. And I think that's also really dangerous. Again, especially in the post-Soviet environment, people are very sensitive about their right to consume information freely. So I think any government entity that is established needs to be very clear and transparent about what it's there for. Is it there to prosecute libel and slander cases? And if it is, it can't just prosecute against Russian disinformation. It has to do it when it sees it, for instance, in domestic outlets as well. Again, being very careful to be fully within the law and protect people's rights. This should be about protecting democracy, not minimizing people's right to freedom of speech and information. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Nina, thanks a lot for your amazing presentation. And it was extremely interesting to hear your perspective as a foreigner on our Ukrainian, let's say mostly Ukrainian problems, and immensely interesting to see those figures you analyzed. And my question is, you're mostly talking about the trust, which is really a problem in Ukrainian society now. We feel it really, the gap of trust to our government on all the levels probably. But in your opinion, is it a problem of media mostly and disinformation, or maybe the problem of government itself?
So I didn't talk about government at all, although I've obviously been dealing a little bit with that in my own work here in Ukraine and hope to one day do that back at home. I think it's a problem on multiple levels. Government also obviously needs to be extremely truthful in the way it communicates to the media. It needs to communicate positive stories about the good things that are happening, but also not be afraid to communicate failures. And I think that's one way that all governments could improve their communications. I don't think media is necessarily at fault for the trust gap. I think, unfortunately, the business environment that media organizations are put in right now is to blame for it, which is, again, turning media away from local stories that might not be as popular to things that are more clickbaity, to things that are bad news, that are scandalous, that get them more eyes on their website, more papers bought, things like that. I don't think you're to blame for that, the media. I think it's just the business environment, and as long as we strategically think about how to change that, both the media and governments who are supporting media, I think we can avert the ship before it hits the iceberg, so to speak. Thanks for your question.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm consulting a Swedish governmental agency on project related to making local power more transparent.
Great.
And your research is quite comprehensive with a lot of data, especially about trust to public institutions. There is also one more dimension related to local power.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when we are comparing the level of trust to government, it's about 10% in different researches. We have the number of trust to local power.
In Ukraine?
Yeah, it's much higher, about 35%.
Yeah.
So really, in such perspective, like, it's not enough, and we have a floor for improvement, but there is still a huge information vacuum and distrust vacuum on local level among local journalists and local officials with whom I am working personally every day. So maybe fast facts, recommendations from you, how to raise awareness among local officials and local journalists to translate and deliver messages more well-balanced and adequate. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that really interesting comment and question. I totally agree. And I think the local level is actually our way in to repairing the trust gap, in my opinion. When people can actually see the changes that are taking place around them, things that happen in the Rada, they're passing a lot of great reforms, but do people feel it on a day-to-day basis? Probably not. But and I always use the example of the playground in the Dvor, I don't know why, but when the playground in the Dvor gets repainted or repaired and your kids are out there playing on it, that's something really tangible for your life. Or, if a road is repaired, for instance. These are things that really affect people's daily lives. So I think the more local government can listen to the people and then respond to their concerns, and the same goes for media. The more media can help be the bridge between people and their government, be the watchdog on local government, then the more that relationship will grow and prosper. And it's really interesting to hear that people have more trust in local government than national government in Ukraine, and I think that would be true. Actually, I'm not sure. What do the Americans in the room think? Do you think that's true for our society? Do you know who your local officials are?
I feel like it may be true in the United States because people have more access, I feel like, to their local governments than they do their federal representatives. There's more knocking on doors in local government, I feel like, things like that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that may be part of it.
Yeah. It's interesting, but I do think that that's the key, especially for media as well, to play that joining role between people and their governments. So I think that's a really interesting thing for anybody who's looking for their next project. That could be it. Any other questions?
Hi, Nina.
Hi.
Good evening. It's good to see you.
Good to
Maxim
see you.
Kyiv from Global Ukraine, from Ukraine. I promised you that I will attend your event, so I had to
Yes.
leave Kyiv Security Forum to
Thank
be
you.
here.
I really
So it means
appreciate
that my promise wasn't a fake, so I am here.
Thanks. Not disinformation.
Right. So you just also mentioned NATO Stratcom as one of the ex-co-authors of the latest research of NATO Stratcom, which is Stratcom Loves, about the role of humor
Yes.
in strategic communications. I think I will not agree with you because this research is probably one of the most popular now. It has become one of the most popular, but mostly in Russian media. So, yeah. But my question is, you just said, so you just provided us with the more general information, but did you try to examine specifically countries like Ukraine or Moldova or maybe some regions? Because it might seem, or it seems to me that the disinformation strategies in those countries, in those regions are pretty different. Thank you.
I did interviews in 6 different countries, and I picked them based on projects that I found interesting. I obviously couldn't go everywhere, so I went to Latvia, Poland, Czech Republic. I've been in Ukraine. I also went to Brussels and London to talk to folks. And I actually thought I would find differing response across the board, but really what I found that united everyone, even though they all have very different media environments, very different relationships with Russia, very different problems with their relationships vis-a-vis Russia, the trust gap is still there. And kind of the response is still very top level or awareness raising across the board as far as I saw it. Obviously, this is not comprehensive. I could not talk to everyone. But it was the common thread amongst everyone that I talked to. In Poland, for instance, they don't really do that much debunking, but they have a really huge trust gap between the people and government and media. And they're kind of talking about disinformation on a wider regional level. And again, awareness raising. The MOD has done some conferences and things like that. They're training officials to spot it, but not talking to the people in the country who are the ones unknowingly spreading rumors that have been propagated by Russia. So this is the common thread. Even though everyone's got kind of a different response, everything is still very surface level, and I'd like to see everybody go a little bit deeper. And I did read the NATO Laughs or Stratcom study. You know, I think the things that, don't get me wrong, I think the Center of Excellence is great. The guys there gave me a wonderful presentation. That's what military men tend to do. They had a whole slideshow prepared for me. They were really, really thorough and comprehensive, and I think they're very smart. But I want to see those studies reach more people. How can we repackage them to get to the people who might not know what the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence is? It's a question that maybe you should think about. Anybody else? And I think this might need to be one of the last questions, maybe 1 or 2 more.
Hi, my name is Elena Steiner. You said a lot about how we can address this question to Ukrainian, European, or American auditory, and still Russian citizens are the biggest and the most affected by Russian propaganda campaign group of people. So how do you think whether there is any chances to address this debunking stuff to Russian citizens, especially taking into account that it's almost impossible to be an independent journalist in Russia, and if you work from any European or American organization, you are labeled as untrustful.
Yeah, oh man, from my time working on Russia, I'm very aware of the risks that journalists and activists take in doing their really important work in Russia, and it's definitely a problem. I focused on the European information environment, obviously, because there's a little bit more room for improvement there. The situation actually, I think, has a potential solution, and in Russia, the situation is much more difficult. The best thing that I could say is that we need to be delivering these messages through entertainment means. And Peter Pomerantsev has written a lot about this. Again, it's really hard because the entire information market is controlled by Putin. But I think if there's a way to deliver it, obviously hitting people over the head with what most people would call anti-propaganda is not going to work, but slipping it in through talk shows, soap operas, these things would be really interesting, and I think is a way for Russian society as a whole, artists and thinkers of that nature, to respond without being overtly political. I think in terms of the Western response or any Western support to this arena, that gets a little bit sticky because, again, you're getting into artistic freedom, editorial policies there. That's not something we tend to do openly, but I think there's room for some creative thinking that might not be in the news realm. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't read it to read Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, about his time as a TV producer in Russia during the 90s. It can really inform some of the debates that we're having today. Thanks for that excellent question. Anybody else? One last question? Okay.
Hi, my name is Roman. I am from Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And
Woohoo,
probably
UCMC.
yeah, and probably my question would be: there is a tensions in Western academia that actually debunking myth and fakes actually empower them and make them more sound, I don't know, brilliant, and help to raise more people. Do you agree with this tension? And probably we should do something else from this.
Well, I think some debunking is important. I do agree with you, but let me give you one example. If you're familiar, the Lisa case in Germany, which happened, I think, at the beginning of 2016 in January. So it was this fake news story that was originally propagated by a fringe Russian outlet that said a 13-year-old girl of German-Russian origin had been raped by a bunch of refugees. It turned out not to be true. And by the time it was debunked and proven to be debunked, it had really gained a lot of notoriety. If a government or another organization like Stop Fake or any of its German brothers and sisters were able to have debunked that story earlier on, it may not have taken on the life that it did. And if we had not debunked it, who knows what would have happened. I think it already had an effect on German public opinion in that case because it was allowed to take on a life of its own. But debunking can be really important sometimes. And like I said, I think it's important for analytical reasons as well. However, I do agree that it does sometimes lend notoriety to outlets and stories that should not be getting the attention that we give them through debunking. It also allows Russia to set the narrative. And there's one more thing that I wanted to say, and it has slipped my mind. I'm going to think for 5 more seconds. Nope, it's gone. I'll try to remember afterward, but I do agree with you. Oh, no, I remember what it was. It is that there have been studies that prove no matter how many times something is debunked or proven to be false, and we saw this with our own election in the fall, people remember the false thing rather than the true thing because it's been in their brain longer. And so we run the risk of doing that and kind of wasting resources there. So that's why I'd like to see some of those resources diverted to projects that are more long-term in general. And thank you for the great question and the work that you do with UCMC. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I'm happy to talk afterward if you have any more questions, comments, concerns. Follow me on Twitter. Share my op-ed if you feel so inclined. Thank you. Thanks for coming.